I'm trying to make not to make too much noise. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, boys and girls. I hope everyone's doing well today. So, as requested, as sponsored, tonight, today, this morning, whatever, we shall continue with our reading of the English Constitution by Walter Bagehot. Ideally, we'll get through this book as compared to the earlier bedtime stories, none of which we managed to get through, but we shall see, shan't we? Without further ado, let us begin. This fusion of the legislative and executive functions may, to those who have not considered it, seem but a dry and small matter to be the latent essence and effectual secret of the English Constitution. But we can only judge of its real importance by looking at a few of its principal effects and contrasting it very shortly with its great competitor, which seems likely, unless care be taken, to outstrip it in the progress of the world. That competitor is the presidential system. The characteristic of it is that the president is elected from the people by one process and the House of Representatives by another. The independence of the legislative and executive powers is the specific quality of presidential government, just as their fusion and combination is the precise principle of cabinet government. First, compare the two in quiet times. The essence of a civilized age is that administration requires the continued aid of legislation. One principal and necessary kind of legislation is taxation. The expense of civilized government is continually varying. It must vary if the government does its duty. The miscellaneous estimates of the English government contain an inevitable medley of changing items. Education, prison discipline, art, science, civil contingencies of 100 kinds require more money one year and less another. The expense of defense, the naval and military estimates, vary still more as the danger of attack seems more or less imminent. As the means of retarding such danger becomes more or less costly, if the persons who have to do the work are not the same as those who have to make the laws, there will be a controversy between two sets of persons. The tax imposers are sure to quarrel with the tax requirers. The executive is crippled by not getting the law it needs, and the legislative is spoiled by having to act without responsibility. The executive becomes unfit for its name since it cannot execute what it decides on. The legislature is demoralized by liberty, by taking decisions of which others, and not itself, will suffer the effects. In America, so much has this difficulty been felt that a semi-connection has grown up between the legislature and the executive. When the Secretary of the Treasury of the federal government wants a tax, he consults upon it with the chairman of the Financial Committee of Congress. He cannot go down to Congress himself and propose what he wants. He can only write a letter and send it. But he tries to get the chairman of the Finance Committee who likes his tax. But he tries to get a chairman of the Finance Committee who likes his tax. Through that chairman, he tries to persuade the committee to recommend such tax. By that committee, he tries to induce the House to adopt that tax. But such a chain of communications is liable to continual interruptions. It may suffice for a single tax on a fortunate occasion, but will scarcely pass a complicated budget. We do not say in a war or a rebellion. We are now comparing the cabinet system and presidential system in quiet times, but in times of financial difficulty. Two clever men never exactly agreed about a budget. We have by present practice an Indian Chancellor of the Exchequer talking English finance at Calcutta, and an English one talking Indian finance in England. But the figures are never the same, and the views of policy are rarely the same. One most angry controversy has amused the world, and probably others scarcely less interesting are hidden in the copious stores of our Anglo-Indian correspondence. But relations something like these must subsist between the head of a finance committee in the legislature and a finance minister in the executive. They are sure to quarrel, and the result is sure to satisfy neither. And when the taxes do not yield as they were expected to yield, who is responsible? Very likely the Secretary of the Treasury could not persuade the chairman. Very likely the chairman could not persuade his committee. Very likely the committee could not persuade the assembly. Whom then can you punish? Whom can you abolish when your taxes run short? There's nobody save the legislature, a vast miscellaneous body difficult to punish, and the very persons to inflict the punishment. Nor is the financial part of administration the only one which requires, in a civilized age, the constant support and accompaniment of facilitating legislation. All administration does so. In England, on a vital occasion, the cabinet can compel legislation by the threat of resignation and the threat of dissolution. But neither of these can be used in a presidential state. There, the legislature cannot be dissolved by the executive government, and it does not heed a resignation, for it has not to find the successor. Accordingly, when a difference of opinion arises, the legislature is forced to fight the executive, and the executive is forced to fight the legislature. And so very likely they contend to the conclusion of their respective terms. There is indeed one condition of things in which this description, though still approximately true, is nevertheless not exactly true, and that is when there is nothing to fight about. Before the rebellion in America, owing to the vast distances of other states and the favorable economic conditions of the country, there were very few considerable subjects of contention. But if that government had been tried by the English legislation of the last 30 years, the discordant action of the two powers whose constant cooperation is essential to the best government would have shown itself much more distinctly. Nor is this the worst. Cabinet governments educate the nation. The presidential one does not educate it and may corrupt it. I'm just going to add a few notes for us to discuss in the future. 16. I'm reading all of your comments, but obviously I'm not going to comment on them. Cabinet governments educate the nation. The presidential one does not educate and may corrupt it. It has been said that England invented the phrase Her Majesty's opposition, that it was the first government which made a criticism of administration as much a part of the polity as administration itself. This critical opposition is the consequence of cabinet government. The great scene of debate, the great engine of popular instruction and political controversy, is the Legislative Assembly. A speech there by an eminent statesman, a party movement by a great political combination are the best means yet known for arousing, enlivening, and teaching a people. The cabinet system ensures such debates, for it makes them the means by which statesmen advertise themselves for future and confirm themselves in present government. It brings forward men eager to speak and gives them occasions to speak. The deciding catastrophes of cabinet governments are critical divisions preceded by fine discussions. Everything which is worth saying, everything which ought to be said, most certainly will be said. Conscientious men think they ought to persuade others. Selfish men think they would like to obtrude themselves. The nation is forced to hear two sides, all the sides perhaps, of that which most concerns it, and it likes to hear. It is eager to know. I just want to take a moment here to talk about this, right? Bagehot is talking about the fact that the Legislative Assembly allows people to speak and that people want to hear. People want to hear. But it is only the educated and interested people. And that makes it a very big distinction, because most of the country let me note this down. But most of the country, as Bagehot noted, is not educated or interested in the efficient part of government. And that is where sort of modern issues lie, right? So just this needs to be said now before I move on. Yes. Okay. Human nature despises long arguments which come to nothing, heavy speeches which precede no motion, abstract disquisitions which leave visible things where they are. But all men heed great results, and a change of government is a great result. It has 100 ramifications, it runs through society, it gives hope to many, and it takes away hope from many. It is one of those marked events which, by its magnitude and its melodrama, impresses men even too much, and debates which have this catastrophe at the end of them, or may so have it, are sure to be listened to and sure to sink deep into the national mind. Again, the national mind of those who actually think about these things, right? But we should say this: agency. We'll talk about this in the future. Debates lead to collapse of government and agency. Okay. Travelers, even in the northern states of America, the greatest and best of presidential countries, have noticed that the nation was not especially addicted to politics, that they have not a public opinion finished and chastened as that of the English has been finished and chastened. A great many hasty writers have charged this defect on the Yankee race, on the Anglo-American character. But English people, if they had no motive to attend to politics, certainly would not attend to politics. At present, there is business in their attention. They assist at the determining crisis, they retard or help it. Whether the government will go out or remain is determined by the debate and by the division in Parliament. And the opinion out of doors, the secret pervading decision of society has a great influence on that division. The nation feels that its judgment is important, and it strives to judge. It succeeds in deciding because the debates and the discussions give it the facts and the arguments. But under a presidential government, a nation has, except at the electing moment, no influence. It has not the ballot box before it, its virtue is gone, and it must wait till its instant of despotism again returns. It is not incited to form an opinion like a nation under a cabinet government, nor is it instructed like such a nation. There are doubtless debates in the legislature, but they are prologues without play. There is nothing nothing of catastrophe about them. You cannot turn out the government. The prize of power is not in the gift of the legislature, and no one cares for the legislature. It's like you were alive today. The executive, the great center of power and place, sticks irremovable. You cannot change it in any event. The teaching apparatus, which has educated our public mind, which prepares our resolution, which shapes our opinions, does not exist. No presidential country needs to form daily delicate opinions or is helped in forming them. It might be thought that the discussions in the press would supply the deficiencies of the Constitution, that by a reading people especially, the conduct of their government would be as carefully watched, that their opinions about it would be as consistent, as accurate, as well considered under a presidential as under a cabinet polity. But the same difficulty oppresses the press which oppresses the legislature. It can do nothing. It cannot change the administration. The executive was elected for such and such years, and for such and such years it must last. People wonder that so literary a people as the Americans, a people who read more than any people who ever lived, who read so many newspapers, Okay, now you can tell that he's obviously not living in the present anymore. Americans read a lot. Sorry, I'm intensely amused by this. I forgot about these passages. But it can do nothing. Blah blah blah. Yes, a people who read more than any people who ever lived. Yes, I realize you guys are laughing. Thank you. Should have such bad newspapers. The papers are not as good as the English papers because they have not the same motive to be good as the English papers. At a political crisis, as we say, that is, when the fate of the administration is unfixed, when it depends on a few votes, yet unsettled, upon a wavering and veering opinion, effective articles in great journals become of essential moment. The Times has made many ministries, when, as of late, there has been a long continuance of divided parliaments, of governments which were without brute voting power, and which depend on intellectual strength. The support of the most influential organ of English opinion has been of critical moment. If a Washington newspaper could have turned down Mr. Lincoln, there would have been good writing and fine argument in the Washington newspapers. But the Washington newspapers can no more remove a president during his term of place than the Times can remove a Lord Mayor during his year of office. Nobody cares for a debate in Congress which comes to nothing, and no one reads long articles which have no influence on events. The Americans glance at the heads of news and through the paper. They do not enter upon a discussion. They do not think of entering on a discussion which would be useless. After saying that the division of the legislative and executive in presidential governments weaken the legislative power, it may seem a contradiction to say that it also weakens the executive power. But it is not a contradiction. The division weakens the whole aggregate force of government, the entire imperial power, and therefore it weakens both halves. The executive is weakened in a very plain way. In England, a strong cabinet can obtain the concurrence of the legislature in all acts which facilitate its administration. It is itself, so to say, the legislature, but a president may be hampered by the parliament, and is likely to be hampered. The natural tendency of the members of every legislature is to make themselves conspicuous. They wish to gratify an ambition laudable or blamable. They wish to promote the measures they think best for public welfare. They wish to make their will felt in great affairs. In other words, agency, by the way. All these mixed motives urge them to oppose the executive. They are embodying the purpose of others if they aid. They are advancing their own opinions if they defeat. They are first if they vanquish. They are auxiliaries if they support. The weakness of the American executive used to be the great theme of all critics before the Confederate Rebellion. Congress and committees of Congress, of course, impeded the executive when there was no coercive public sentiment to check and rule them. But the presidential system not only gives the executive power an antagonist in the legislative power, and so makes it weaker, but it also enfeebles it by impairing its intrinsic quality. A cabinet is elected by a legislature, and when that legislature is composed of fit persons, that mode of electing the executive is the very best. It is a case of secondary election, under the only conditions in which secondary elections is preferable to primary. Generally speaking, in an electioneering country, I mean in a country full of political life and used to the manipulation of popular institutions, the election of candidates to elect candidates is a farce. The Electoral College of America is so... It was intended that the deputies, when assembled, should exercise a real discretion and by independent choice select the president. But the primary electors take too much interest. They only elect a deputy to vote for Mr. Lincoln or Mr. Breckinridge, and the deputy only takes a ticket and drops that ticket in an urn. He never chooses or thinks of choosing. He is but a messenger, a transmitter. The real decision is in those who choose him because they knew what he would do. It is true that the British House of Commons is subject to the same influences. Members are mostly, perhaps, elected because they will vote for a particular ministry rather than for purely legislative reasons. But, and here is the capital distinction, the functions of the House of Commons are important and continuous. It does not, like the Electoral College in the United States, separate when it has elected its ruler. It watches, legislates, seats and unseats ministries from day to day. Accordingly, it is a real electoral body. The Parliament of 1857, which, more than any other parliament of late years, was a parliament elected to support a particular premier, which was chosen, as the Americans might say, upon the Palmerston ticket, before it had been in existence 2 years, dethroned Lord Palmerston. Though selected in the interest of a particular ministry, it in fact destroyed that ministry. I will say that I love the fact that you guys are commenting like that. It's good because we tend to forget these very fundamental issues that exist, or we take them out of context. Whereas here we are thinking about them in context, and we are thinking about them in a way that is healthy because we're not only going at it in opposition, if that makes sense. A good parliament, too, is a capital choosing body. If it is fit to make laws for a country, its majority ought to represent the general average intelligence of that country. It's its various members ought to represent various special interests, special opinions, special prejudices to be found in that community. There ought to be an advocate for every particular sect and a vast neutral body of no sect, homogeneous and judicial like the nation itself. Such a body, when possible, is the best selector of executives that can be imagined. It is full of political activity. It is close to political life. It feels the responsibility of affairs which are brought, as it were, to its threshold. It has as much intelligence as the society in question chances to contain. It is what Washington or Hamilton strove to create, an electoral college of the picked men of the nation. The best mode of appreciating its advantages is to look at their alternative. The competing constituency is the nation itself, and this is, according to theory and experience, in all but the rarest cases a bad constituency. Mr. Lincoln, at his second election, being elected when all the federal states had set their united hearts on a single object, was voluntarily re-elected by an actually choosing nation. He embodied the object in which everyone was absorbed. But this is almost the only presidential election of which so much can be said. In almost all cases, the president is chosen by a machinery of caucuses and combinations too complicated to be perfectly known, and too familiar to require description. He is not the choice of the nation, he is the choice of the wire pullers. A very large constituency in quiet times is the necessary, almost legitimate subject of electioneering management. A man cannot know that he does not throw his vote away except he votes as part of some great organization, and if he votes as a part, he abdicates his electoral function in favor of the managers of that association. The nation, political parties, by the way, the nations, even if it chose for itself, would, in some degree, be an unskilled body. But when it does not choose for itself, but only as latent agitators wish, it is like a large, lazy man with a small, vicious mind. It moves slowly and heavily, The moves at the bidding of a bad intention. It means little. Oh my god, I love this. It means little, but it means that little ill. And as the nation is less able to choose than a parliament, so it has worse people to choose out of. What timing are we at? Not. Oh, fantastic. I hope you are all learning something from this. And as the nation is less able to choose than a parliament, so it has worse people to choose out of. The American legislators of the last century have been much blamed for not permitting the ministries of the president to be members of the assembly. But with reference to the specific end which they had in view, they saw clearly and decided wisely. They wished to keep the legislative branch absolutely distinct from the executive branch. They believed such a separation to be essential to a good constitution. They believed such a separation to exist in the English, which the wisest of them thought the best constitution. And to the effectual maintenance of such a separation, the exclusion of the president's ministers from the legislature is essential. If they are not excluded, they become the executive. They eclipse the president himself. A legislative chamber is greedy and covetous. It acquires as much, it concedes as little as possible. The passions of its members are its rulers. The lawmaking faculty, the most comprehensive of the imperial faculties, is its instrument. It will take the administration if it can take it, tried by their own aims. The founders of the United States were wise in excluding the ministers from Congress. But though this exclusion is essential to the presidential system of government, it is not for that reason a small evil. It causes the degradation of public life. Unless a member of the legislature be sure of something more than speech, unless he is incited by the hope of action and chastened by the chance of responsibility, a first-rate man will not care to take the place and will not do much if he does take it. To belong to a debating society adhering to an executive, and this is no inapt description of a Congress under a presidential constitution, it is not an object to stir a noble ambition and is a position to encourage idleness. I'm going to stop here for a moment and just write part of my thought out that we will discuss next time. Fixed term governments encourage laziness and timed electioneer. Right, essentially what Bagehot is saying is that in the first few years they don't really care enough until the midterms arrive, and then they start campaigning, and then once the midterms are over they become lazy again, and then they start campaigning for the next event, right? Because it's on such a cycle, it makes society really cyclical. Yes. Tautology. The members of a parliament excluded from office can never be comparable, much less equal, to those of a parliament not excluded from office. The presidential government, by its nature, divides political life into two halves, an executive half and a legislative half, and by so dividing it, makes neither half worth a man worth his making it a continuous career, worthy to absorb as cabinet government absorbs his whole soul. The statesmen from whom a nation chooses under a presidential system are much inferior to those from whom it chooses under a cabinet system, while the selecting apparatus is also far less discerning. All these advantages are more important at critical periods because government itself is more important. A formed public opinion, a respectable, able, and disciplined legislature, a well-chosen executive, a parliament, and an administration not thwarting each other but cooperating with with each other, are of far greater consequence when great affairs are in progress than when small affairs are. When there is much to do than when there is little to do. But in addition to this, a parliamentary or cabinet constitution possesses an additional and special advantage in very dangerous times. It has what we may call a reserve of power fit for and needed by extreme exigencies. And here we shall end for today. I do apologize that this bedtime story has turned into one of me laughing at you, all of you, most of you. In part because these are existential questions that we, I think, have lost the sight of in the 21st century, right? And it's a little bit sad to see. But anyway, we are done for today. So I wish everyone a wonderful evening, good morning, good afternoon. Those of you who are going to school, just go to school. Those of you who are going to a meeting, please go to a meeting. Those of you who are sleeping, good night. Thank you very much for watching. In conclusion, please stop Firefox, please stop to Chrome, and I shall see all of you tomorrow for walking around Japan.